I'd like to start with the talk, the first talk that will be given by Dr. Zander. Dr. Zander, apart from being a colleague, is a friend, an archaeologist, and he's been working for the Fabric of St. Peter's since 1998, where he's responsible for the necropolis and artistic goods section. He also teaches at the Gregorian University and is a member, I think this is very interesting for our work, a member of the Permanent Commission for the Safeguarding of Historic and Artistic Monuments of the Holy See. His talk, Principles for the Knowledge and Protection of the Religious Cultural Heritage. Over to you. I thank my friend and colleague, Dr. Buccarelli, and the organizers of this event, this meeting, for having invited me to give a short introductory talk to this section of our meeting dedicated to cataloguing the cultural heritage of consecrated life. The subject entrusted to me is Principles for the Knowledge and Protection, Safeguarding of the Religious Cultural Heritage. The basic principle is easy to understand by those who are engaged in this work, but not generally known to those who are called on to engage with and act on an effective work for protecting cultural goods with which they have been entrusted. So my talk will be brief. The first form of protection of an asset is the knowledge of the asset itself. This basic principle is easy to understand and can be applied to any kind of good. It's only possible to safeguard and enhance what is known. The generic definition of good includes both environmental goods not produced by human beings and cultural goods produced by human beings, which can be immaterial, like language, customs, traditions, behavior, and so on, or material. The latter can in turn be divided into two categories: immovable heritage, architectural complexes, buildings and monuments, and so on, and movable goods, paintings, sculptures, furniture, especially in a religious environment, paintings, sculptures, furniture, furnishings, clothing, artifacts, and we could carry on the list. Movable assets, movable goods include archival and book assets, which are not going to be included in this talk because they will be addressed by others. I will focus in particular on movable property, movable goods, on those most at risk and that need protection, special protection to avoid their deterioration, destruction, or dispersion. As already mentioned, the protection of an asset, and especially of a movable asset, is based on the knowledge of that good, that asset. Hence, the importance of making an inventory of all those artifacts that are of religious, artistic, historical, archaeological, or ethnographic interest. This morning, in the Holy Father's message, one of the sentences at the very start was to promote cataloguing as a primary act of knowledge. So this concept is a key point of this meeting today. This inventorying was already known to the ancients, who used to inventory the most valuable material and artistic artifacts. I have to think of the bronze statue of the so-called Hellenistic prince in a Roman museum. on which is engraved a 2nd century BC inscription referring to an inventory register, or in the context of the Vatican Basilica, where I work, think of the inventories of the Vatican chapter kept from the 15th century and those of the Fabbrica di San Pietro, which from the beginning of the 16th century were compiled and constantly updated, not only for artistic artifacts, but also and above all for the materials and tools used in the great building of the Petrine building site, tools that themselves are subject to protection now. The census and inventory, therefore, constitute the first form of protection, and above all of a mobile asset, an object or artifact that can be removed or moved more or less easily. The need for ecclesial bodies to draw up an inventory is provided for in Canon 1283 of the Code of Canon Law. A similar concern is expressed in several documents by the Italian Bishops' Conference and its Office for Cultural Heritage, working for many years in this primary action of protection, having coordinated since 1996 an impressive computerized inventory campaign of the historical and artistic heritage of the Italian diocese. Dr. Franceschini, who runs the Italian Bishops' Conference, there are 4 million file cards, so to speak, already in use for this heritage in Italy. We recall in particular the circular letter of the Pontifical Commission for the Cultural Heritage of the Church on the necessity and urgency of inventory and cataloguing, dated 8 December 1999, a document that clearly reaffirms the primary importance of inventorying for the knowledge, safeguarding, and enhancement of the historical artistic heritage. It's significant to point out that also the law 344 of the Vatican City State on the protection of the cultural heritage, after Article 1, defining the object of the discipline, concerns the obligation of inventory, indicated as mandatory. With regard to the inventory of movable goods, paintings, sculptures, furniture, and so on, the work calls for planning, adequate resources, qualified staff, specific investigative and reconnaissance methodology. Work planning is an activity that should not be underestimated, because the success of all subsequent operational organization depends on a good approach. Without careful planning, based on knowledge of the entire process for achieving the objectives of safeguarding and enhancement, there is a risk of undertaking unprofitable or even pointless work. For this reason, a preliminary survey of the heritage to be inventoried, catalogued, is usually carried out in order to identify the consistency, typology, and location of the artifacts. An experienced person with the help of collaborators will therefore have to carry out the necessary inspections and, first of all, a photographic campaign aimed at documenting all the artifacts in their various locations. In recent years, there has been increasing use of 4K video footage from which it's possible to extrapolate frames in good resolution. Photographing the context in which individual works are kept, even if they don't correspond to their original location, can be of great importance. For example, to establish possible relationships with the building or links between different objects, to document the origin of objects that might later find a different location, or to better understand the causes of possible deterioration. In the course of such surveys, you can identify and report any locations at risk for the conservation and safety of works, enabling appropriate measures to be taken swiftly. This initial general census does not provide for the registration of objects, but only the preparation of a report to quantify, qualify, and define the methods and timing of the work to be done. Depending on the size and type of heritage to be inventoried, adequate financial resources should be identified. In calculating the individual items of expenditure, it should be borne in mind that the inventory, the registering of an asset by means of the orderly and systematic collection of information, is only the beginning of a more complex and articulated activity that will develop in greater depth with cataloguing, allowing, through the refinement of knowledge, more effective action of conservation, protection, and enhancement. A high initial investment will allow for more meticulous, documented, and thorough survey, with the possibility of acquiring more information about the inventoried artifacts. Thus, it will facilitate the subsequent stages of the work to implement the necessary measures for the conservation and security of the structures more quickly, of these works more quickly. For qualified personnel are needed to compile the inventory catalogue sheets and to manage the inventory catalogue. Depending on the type of material to be investigated, it is possible to identify one or more persons with specific training in material culture through their CVs. In this respect, education is important, but experience is especially so. If necessary, the archivist must be able to call on the collaboration of others with different skills from his or her own, be able to call on technicians and photographers to provide visual aids to the cards, and have a good command of the use and management of cataloguing programs. Of particular importance is the figure of the photographer specialized in the documentation of objects to be inventoried, which they must be photographed on all sides with the correct lighting and appropriate equipment, according to a pre-established shooting plan. This is to guarantee the completeness of the visual information and to assure that the correct documentation of the different categories of artifacts. The head of each inventory and cataloguing project, which for particularly important institutions or places may involve several qualified recorders, professional photographers, and art historians, is usually a coordinator who also has the task of checking the correctness of the content of each record. The need for qualified personnel for this type of intervention has been particularly felt in recent years, and many European, Italian, and Vatican universities and institutions have set up specific training and refresher courses. A long time ago, with the circular letter of 15th of September 2006 of the Pontifical Commission for the Cultural Heritage of the Church, was concerned to provide some practical guidelines for the inventory of the cultural assets of institutes of consecrated life and societies of apostolic life. The Italian Bishops' Conference took care to make available free of charge software for the inventory of historical, artistic, and archival assets to anyone who requested it, while at the same time ensuring the training of personnel, technical assistance, and the possibility of updating through access to the forum. I made an important reference before to the important work done by the Italian Bishops' Conference. With regard to the methodology of the work, greater coordination is important to ensure uniformity of the databases, the application of a uniform method of description, and the use of compatible and updatable programs for the acquisition and management of data related to the relevant images. For the Italian diocese, the work is coordinated by the National Office for Heritage and so on at the Bishops' Conference. In the survey of ecclesiastical heritage, reference is made to the standards of the Central Institute for Cataloguing and the Ministry for Cultural Activities and Tourism, with the addition of further descriptive elements to meet specific cataloguing requirements. For the Vatican City-State, according to the above-mentioned 355 of 2001 on the protection of cultural heritage, this coordination is carried out by the Vatican Museums. On the basis of agreed criteria, the Fabbrica di San Pietro drew up a slightly more elaborate inventory sheet for better monitoring of the goods in its care. After assigning an alphanumeric code to each work, the asset is analytically recorded by drawing up an inventory form on paper and computer, dated and signed. This form contains the personal data needed to identify the item, number, entity entrusted with the work, location, object, author, date, material and technique of execution, measurements and provenance. This part of the file can be considered as the identity card of the protected property at the moment in which it is inventoried. Additional descriptive fields, such as those dedicated to the status of its conservation and notes, are also provided. The space reserved for the state of conservation serves to describe the state of health of the artifact when it's registered. It's like a medical record based on autopsy examination without the aid of laboratory analyses. Even if the indexer is not a restorer, careful observation of the object to document the most obvious signs of deterioration can provide useful information for planning further investigations and possible conservation work. In the case of particularly deteriorated objects, all necessary precautions must be taken, and photographs of the deteriorated parts, if necessary with particularly good lighting, enabling a better reading. For example, in a painting, grazing light to highlight the lifting of the paint film. The notes field allows you to record observations and data that would be inappropriate to enter in other descriptive fields. Additional information fields are also planned for detailed descriptions, bibliography, references to archive documents and iconographic sources, conservation work, temporary exhibitions, and so on. In the more specific case of the Fabbrica di San Pietro, in addition to the bibliography of the inventoried object, reference to the archival documentation is important. In the octagonal halls of the Basilica, there is in fact a historical archive with documents on the works carried out in St. Peter's and on the individual works protected. Similarly useful are references to the papers of the Archivio Capitolare, kept adjacent to the sacristy and partly collected in a specific archival fund of the Vatican Library. References to historical photographs are equally important, as such documentation is of great value in reconstructing the conservation history of the inventoried work with a view to possible restoration. The field dedicated to conservation interventions is an extension of the part of the sheet describing the state of conservation. This field, on what's been done to preserve it, can be considered an extension of the medical record of the work, so-called, because it contains information on any diagnostic investigations, maintenance work, restoration, etc. Finally, the field named exhibitions dedicated to loan of the inventoried work is important for the history and management of that object. There are regulations and working protocols on the loan of works of art, which are subject to constraints and conservation precautions. Before and after each exhibition, there's a thorough review of the state of conservation of the work, carried out jointly by specialized staff of the lending and host museums. An exhibition event is therefore an indication of a checkup carried out on the work. The file is finally accompanied by a series of photographs specially taken to document every part of the artifact and its state of conservation. This activity, as I said, now enabled by the contribution of digital technology, requires experience and professionalism. Such a card, an entry file, can and must be constantly updated by qualified cataloguing staff. It's designed, therefore, to be revised, corrected, and supplemented with new information. Information that is, in some cases, indispensable, such as when the inventoried asset undergoes a change of location due to a decision for the sake of security or conservation. Information that is, in other cases, incidental but nonetheless useful, such as noting temporary movements for exhibition events. The file, therefore, becomes a container of information that not only records its data, specific data, but also bibliographical and archival information and details on the state of conservation, diagnostic surveys, maintenance, and restoration carried out over time. The inventory catalogue form is therefore a source of knowledge and protection that must be continuously updated. It's full of information, which according to established criteria and standards deserve to be shared, not only for the legal protection of the property, but also for the cultural and ecclesial enhancement, its cultural enhancement of the property. Therefore, the planning of the inventory work should also include planning for the management of the inventory and catalogue over time. From the above, it's clear that the work of inventory and cataloguing constitutes an important source of knowledge, but is a prerequisite for any subsequent form of safeguarding and enhancement of the property. In this regard, I'd like to highlight the subject of conservation, which is one of the most important aspects of the protection of cultural heritage, and in particular of the immense religious cultural heritage. There's a material conservation of the artifact, but also a contextual conservation and a functional one. Whenever possible, the object should preserve its link with the place and context in which it was produced and, if possible, its role, its function. 2. A sacred image in a church, for example, should retain its original location and function as a devotional image. Simply moving it to another location or even a museum would not allow its original value and meaning to be adequately appreciated. It should be borne in mind, however, for the reasons that this conference has highlighted, that this form of protection is not always feasible. Cardinal Ravasi this morning reminded us of the problems concerning the non-use and disposal of goods discussed at the God No Longer Lives Here conference. So it's not always possible to guarantee this keeping things in their own context and role. If a failure to contextually preserve the good results in a serious loss of its value and original meaning, a failure to pay attention to material preservation may result in irreparable degradation to the point of loss of the good itself. So all of this to say that as the preliminary phase of this inventory, the preliminary phase allows to start the first measures for suitable preservation of the property, which by its nature is subject to progressive deterioration. If these goods are stored in places or warehouses with adverse microclimatic conditions, it's possible to intervene in these places or find better accommodation, even temporarily. The post-mortem examination carried out on the work for the description, the examination carried out on the work for the description of the state of conservation of the inventory record, together with the relevant photographic documentation, may call for urgent action to make the work safe and/or the carrying out of multispectral photography and diagnostic surveys for the definition of a restoration project to be carried out in the short, medium, or long term. The restoration will then represent a further opportunity for knowledge and appreciation in the sharing and dissemination of the knowledge acquired, but also in the presentation of the work in its newfound integrity. So, making an inventory is an initial path in the complex path of knowledge of the property. Inventory therefore represents the overcoming an important goal, reaching an important goal, but not the achievement of the final objective. Thank you.